You go there for the slides when it's your turn.
I go with you.
Yes.
You are there. You are there, and I go with you. I just go to you.
Yes.
You do exactly that. They decide to. Yes, it's working. Good morning.
And then normally you'll
Well,
be
actually-
next slide.
Well, do you know how this works? I have just one slide.
You have one slide, but well, I don't know if you should do it.
No,
now,
maybe not.
but,
Maybe not.
yeah. If the technician has glued everything together,
Yeah.
it should be just.
Well, maybe I let you do that, because
Okay.
I'm
What do you like?
technically just
No,
not
no.
very neither motivated nor gifted.
If you want to start, I will.
You don't need to worry.
Still 1 minute. No? It's time. Okay, thank you very much. So, good morning. Welcome to the ICRI conference and to this almost pre-final session that tries to summarize all what has been discussed and learned and proposed during the plenaries and the parallel sessions that have been held up to now. And so this will set the stage for the final session about the conclusions and the outlook to the future. I am Giorgio Rossi. You may have noticed me before during this week. And here is the list in the order of the presentations. We will have the report of the first plenary on sustainable research infrastructure on the global arena, the policy developments, lessons learned and strategies. It will be reported by Jan Ruzak. The second plenary on research infrastructures in 30 years' time and how to get there. The report will be made by Catherine Ewart, Associate Director and Stakeholder and International Relations, Science and Technology Facility Council of the United Kingdom. And then we will have the reports of the parallel sessions, those that none of you could follow all because of their parallelism. And so internationalization of research infrastructure, the challenges of transnational access and international sharing will be presented by Maud Evrard, Head of Policy Affairs at Science Europe. The second session on human resources in the development and use of research infrastructures. The rapporteur will be Sabine Hertgen, Acting Head of Unit International Research Organization, Federal Ministry of Education, Science and Research, Austria, and one of the heroes of this organization of ICRI 2018. The third parallel session was on fostering the diversity and overcoming inequality in the development and use of research infrastructures. Frédéric Le Pampec from the Management Board of the European XFEL will be the rapporteur. And the fourth session on enhancing the societal value of research infrastructures had the two rapporteurs, Philippe Froissart, Deputy Head of Unit Research Infrastructure, DG Research and Innovation of the European Commission, and Friedrich Sgaard, Project Administrator, Global Science Forum of the OECD, and the report will be presented by Philippe Froissart. And the fifth parallel session on the research infrastructure and data will be jointly reported by Carnegie Smith, coordinator of the Global Science Forum of the OECD, and by Barbara Sanchez-Solis, head of Center for Research Data Management of the Technical University of Vienna. So I would like to call Jan Ruzak for his first presentation. Yes, green.
Okay. Good morning, everybody. And big congratulations to the Austrian presidency for having organized such a huge and successful event. I will try to give you in the next few minutes my personal view on the first panel, which was dealing with sustainability issues of research infrastructures, and it was a mix of policy development and some examples. This panel was moderated by Jean-David Malot and was composed of an interesting mix, as I said, of policymakers, RI operators and other stakeholders, and has delivered information on a very broad spectrum of issues. The panelists were carefully selected and covered the entire field of the topic given in the title of this panel, allowing us to gain insights in the sustainability from different perspectives. The first two speakers, I hope it works.
The green doesn't work.
Okay, thank you. The first two speakers were setting the scene and making a general introduction to the entire entry conference. The global perspective came in the presentation of Phil Nyawara, and Phil reminded us on the key messages from the last ICRI conference held in South Africa 2 years ago. It was concluded that these messages are, despite the progress made in the last 2 years, still valid. The research infrastructures are not only temples of excellent science and facilitators of innovation, but very often they are also, and we shall to forget that sometimes, directly addressing issues of very vital importance, and they contribute to solutions of fundamental problems of mankind. Research infrastructures were set in the talk of Phil into the societal and regional context, and the SKA research infrastructure was presented as a case to illustrate this. The links to the European perspective have been delivered to the conference by Karina Angieleva, who told us about the very recent development and the follow-up of the Sofia conference on research infrastructures. Karina reminded us on the main findings and recommendations of the Sofia conference and made the link to the Council conclusions, which are very important to us as they are referring to research infrastructures in many aspects. Again, the regional character of the research infrastructures in the international context stood very much in the center of these considerations. Links were made to the role of the research infrastructures, which they play in circulation of knowledge, and the importance of data was stressed. The panel discussion went along these points I have listed here, and several of the issues were tackled, different aspects were discussed. So the chronology of the presentations was a little bit different, and the Minister Sanja Damjanovic came much earlier in the discussions. I decided to present the research infrastructures as cases and examples, as illustration of the findings in the order as they are listed here. We had a beautiful example of a research infrastructure in a remote area, in a challenging environment in the Atacama Desert, and it was presented to us how important it is to respect the regional settings, the environment, the cultural specificities, to successfully proceed with the implementation and operation of these research infrastructures. Examples were brought underlining the importance of communication with the local communities, the local administration, and benefits to the broader society in Peru was shown. I personally liked the revitalization of the vineyard in the close neighborhood of the facility. EMBRC is a relatively fresh ERIC, and concrete examples and challenges on the way to meet the ERIC status on the way were shown to us. I found particularly interesting that a detailed explanation of the importance of a proper business plan was given to be developed and then finally followed in the implementation. It was also stressed, and this is probably also of particular importance for all who consider to go this way, that there are certain benefits in sharing of information and exchanging experience. The IRIS is a project in a preparatory phase, and the description of the concept development and the considerations when and how to become a global player was presented in a very illustrative way and has demonstrated the complexity of these early stage considerations in the RI life cycle. And finally, Minister Sanja Damjanovic presented the first stage of a very important and very interesting ICRI concept in biomedicine, nicely documenting the challenges and the facets which are to be met when bringing a research infrastructure into life. Again, the regional and meta-regional impact and outreach was documented to be an important driver in these considerations. Finally, we have had, so it came also earlier in time, a presentation from Aeroforum where very clear recommendation can be retained from, and I am not going to read it because it's more or less self-explanatory and understandable. Again, I would like to point to the Bulgarian presidency, which came with some general conclusions, and Karina has highlighted those to us. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Jan. And I would like to call to Dr. Ewart for the second session, please.
Good morning, everybody. My name is Catherine Hewitt from STFC in the UK, and I had the pleasure of rapporteuring our second plenary session, which was moderated by Daniel Wasalka. These were the people who were involved in that session, and you can see we had representation there from both the Russian and the Chinese Academy of Sciences, from the Global Science Forum, from our biggest particle physics laboratory, from Share Eric EGI, and also from the network of activities which is forming LEAPS. So what I've done within my slides is I've picked out a few key highlights of what came out of the presentations and the discussions, and then I've summarised what I think those highlights are telling us about where we might expect to be in 30 years from now in our world of research infrastructures. So in terms of that vision of the future, going where no one has gone before, one thing is very clear, that the exciting science that we'll all be talking about 30 years from now is going to be the product of the research infrastructures that we're constructing and operating right now. It's very clear from the presentations that we heard that international cooperation is going to be as important or even more important than it is, and it is a force for good in the world and something I think we should all be proud of. That long-term planning is going to be key to actually constructing the next generation of research infrastructures and also the structure of those research infrastructures across the world. In the next 30 years, we can expect to see new and exciting, dynamic, high-resolution experiments. We'll also expect to see synergies across the research infrastructures that we know about now, and increasingly networks of research infrastructures coming together. Societal impact will be even more important than it is now. Research infrastructures will be responding to complex global challenges which require even greater engagement with stakeholders and with local communities of interest around research infrastructures. And science will continue to be driving our strategy, as well as driven by our strategy, particularly in particle physics, the particle physics example we had. We can expect the trend towards globalization to continue. We can expect research infrastructures to be drivers of open science. And the example of social sciences was a very important one there. Not all research infrastructures are tangible physical infrastructures. Surveys are incredibly important to this area of research. They enable country comparisons and studies of change over very long periods of time. And one thing is sure, in 30 years from now, the data that we've collected from those surveys will be even more valuable than it is today. Thinking of data, very, very fast pace of development that we're seeing now. And we heard that 10 years from now is actually the far future when we're thinking about what's happening in the data world. It's clear that we're going to need new skills, for example, to just make sure that the sustainability of data repositories is there. And we can expect a federation of data, computing and applications and other open science resources providing scalable access to research data from a very, very broad range of disciplines. And infrastructures increasingly becoming open by default. We'll also be seeing research infrastructures joining forces to prepare for the future, and very importantly from a government point of view, a funding point of view, maximising the return on the investments that we've made in the past. And to do that effectively will require strong organisational structures and good governance. So in summary, I think what we've seen over the last 30 years is nothing short of a technological and societal revolution in our area. And 30 years from now, long-term planning and international cooperation will deliver synergies between RIs, greater societal impact. RIs will still be science-driven and driving science. They'll take many different forms, including surveys, and the outputs will be open by default. And getting there will require new skills and the involvement of broader groups of interest. How will we get there? Well, that's evolving. It's also involving more people than are in this room. And we can expect the results 30 years from now to be just as revolutionary as the past 30 years. And hopefully that sets up the discussions that have taken place in the parallel sessions. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you, Catherine. So now we move to the parallel sessions. The first one of them was on the internationalization of research infrastructure, challenges of transnational access and international sharing. And Maud Everard is presenting the report.
Thank you, Giorgio. So I had the privilege of following the discussion yesterday during the internationalization of research infrastructure session. This very session aimed to reflect on a few aspects, including the need to increase the visibility of research infrastructures and their services to international stakeholders. It reflected also on the challenges of transnational access and of international sharing of results, and reflected on the respective roles of national funding agencies, national authorities, institutions, and researchers. We had 4 different discussion streams, so to say, starting with identifying and stimulating broader stakeholder engagement, then moving on to fostering cooperation and synergies whilst avoiding unnecessary duplication of facilities and services, optimizing the use and outcome of national research infrastructures through international participation, and the last but not least, devising mechanisms for stimulating and supporting international cooperation. When it comes to the outcomes, I think we had a very frank, open discussion yesterday, mainly focusing on the issues facing facilities and the challenges they have in trying to address those issues. I think we can fairly say that we had more questions than answers, but I think it was a very fruitful exercise of mutual learning amongst the panelists and the audience. I will ask you to bear with me because it was a very rich discussion. We had 17 speakers on the stage, a very engaged audience, and in total 6 hours of discussion and exchange. So I will, as a rapporteur, I've been asked to be very concise, so please bear in mind that it's actually a very summary of what was discussed yesterday, and hopefully the written report that will be produced after the conference will provide you with more details. So, when developing international research infrastructures, or opening up the international access to existing ones. One of the first challenges is to identify and stimulate broader stakeholder involvement. That requires time and resources to reach out to new partners, to establish communication lines, to define priorities. I've decided to entitle the outcome of this session as Breaking Up the Silos, because during the discussion we talked about the data silos and focused on, indeed, the need for interoperability, and we discussed whether interoperability should be encouraged through brokering strategies or regulated. We've also touched upon research data management and the need to focus on this whole management to go beyond the mere sharing of the results. We've also touched indeed on the standards and reflected on the fact that following a comment from one of the panelists, quality assurance and quality control are indeed crucial, but there's also a need to recognize that in some instances they can often represent a barrier to the entry of newcomers and a barrier to inclusiveness. Talking about silos, we've also touched upon those existing between governments, academia, businesses, and citizens. We've mainly debated commercial sector engagement in the sector of satellite data provision. And based on recent developments where this sector has brought new ideas, has been more and more engaged, bringing innovations, we've reflected on the fact that it has somehow affected the relationship between data providers and data users. And we've also reflected on the impact this can have in the long term, on the long-term sustainability of research infrastructures. We've also touched upon not so much the silos, but the imbalance that can exist between global north and global south. And as mentioned by one of the panelists, in many instances, it's preferable to invest in knowledge, skills transfer, rather than technology transfer. We've also reflected on a silo that can exist between newcomers and founders of facilities, and reflected on the possible tension existing between the need to open up a stakeholder pool to access an existing facility against the need to secure the commitment and engagement of existing partners. And last but not least, one aspect was, I think, praised yesterday, was the transnational access as the one provided through the European Union Framework for Research and Innovation. It was welcome as a unique opportunity for one-to-one relation building and a unique opportunity for researchers to further not only their careers, but the internationalization of their research. So once the partners of an international research infrastructures have been identified and engaged with, steps need to be taken to foster cooperation between researchers, facilities, institutions, and also in order to avoid, foster the value of those infrastructures, unnecessary duplications of services and facilities needs to be avoided. I've decided to entitle this slide, "It's All About Seeds." All the panelists that shared their experience during the second part of the session were working with distributed research infrastructures in environmental science. And one of the challenges is indeed to ensure effective coverage of the planet in order to get its pulse. They all talked about the elements related to the culture and the challenges related to fostering cooperation between what are very often national-based research communities. They talked about the challenges of actually building those communities across borders, and also the challenges related to overcoming the cultural barriers in the very way that science is done. There's also challenges related to the capacities of those facilities, whether relating to aspects of technology, human capacities, and data management. Co-design with users and stakeholders with a clear, specific goal were also mentioned as a possible way forward to avoid those unnecessary duplication of facilities and services. We touched upon the costs of those facilities and the need to scale up from the project level to have some coordination of the funding and also long-term operation and maintenance. And then during the discussion between the panelists and in the audience, there was quite a long discussion on the so-called healthy interplay between competition and cooperation. It came up a few times also throughout the day, but I've summarized most of the points on that aspect here. So it was down to how do we ensure that competition occurs at the project level whilst ensuring services provision by the research infrastructures. The role of the funders, the funding agencies in that respect was also debated, and some shared their experience when funders were actually calling on the communities to come together and develop a common vision. Later on during the day, there was also discussion as whether this interplay was actually depending on the type of facilities at stake, their maturity, or just the very importance of the issue at stake for society. Then the next part of the session pretty much built on the fact that, to the exception of a very few large-scale facilities, almost all of the research infrastructures are essentially national. That means, and that calls for the development of access regime for foreign researchers and also for specific financing models. That we've heard about the French case, which back in 2016 undertook a full cost analysis. The government undertook a full cost analysis, and which amounted to almost 1.4 billion euro investment at the national or organizational level in research infrastructure in France. That puts quite some pressure for things to run smoothly both at the national, pan-European, international level. Calls for, indeed, certain types of access. A lot of emphasis was put on the excellence and merit-based access to the facilities, and it was noted that the industry access was still rather limited. When it comes to the very policies relating to aspects, they very much depend on the type of infrastructure, whether they're of national, pan-European, or international scope, but it also depends on the type of funding and the source of funding, whether it's coming from the ministry level or the funding organization level. We've also heard about an interesting initiative in Norway to develop a research infrastructure resource model aiming to price the use of research infrastructures. Quite a few of the challenges related to this were mentioned, including the need for a cultural shift from the free access of the perceived free access to facilities to a full cost access approach. Indeed, administration needs to be kept to a minimum, and that's why flat rates are being used in this Norwegian model. And also poses question regarding the very definition of capacity of research infrastructures, and, for instance, the need to set aside funding for idle time. The very ambition in this model is really to make research infrastructure cost eligible in all funding schemes, so that once that's dealt with, we can focus on the science and maximizing the use of research infrastructures. When it comes to data, one of the panelists rightly said, use it or lose it. Really appreciate that. And behind that was the need, indeed, to acknowledge the fact that using the data provides new insight and ensure that the data structure is kept up to standards for interoperability. Building on that, I've also added the fact that when it comes to data, it should generate some to use some. I think in some cases, it can be called upon each data user to actually generate data when appropriate, as a possible trigger for commitment to the success of the facility. And then last but not least, I finished on that session with a question that was put to us by one of the panelists as to whether we should move towards transnational research institutions and tap into such dream model so that they could actually react to global imperative more rapidly and strategically than intergovernmental organization. But also as in vehicles to advocate for and lead the development of an operation of major international research infrastructures. Moving to the last part of the session, which dealt with devising mechanism for stimulating and supporting international collaboration. They have entitled my slide here, the matchmakers, because we reviewed a series of mechanisms that's all aimed to foster partnerships. We started with a voluntary alignment model, such as the one designed by the group of senior officials, which is a sort of good practice framework, which encompasses 14 key principles for operation management of global research infrastructures that deal with merit-based access, data policies, international mobilities, socioeconomic impact, etc. They all aim to encourage alignment and accelerate partnerships. Pretty much complementary to this, we've also heard about grassroots processes, especially in the domain of astroparticles, particle and nuclear physics, which pretty much relies on road mapping exercise, either region-based or theme-based. They also rely on community consensus building through conventions or working group. But they also pretty much build on personal connection that can be established and maintained at conferences and seminars. On the more formal side of the spectrum, we indeed have the bilateral or multilateral agreements and conventions. And in that instance, the example of the role that the Kurchatov Institute plays in mega science projects was presented to us. We also heard about international mapping of research infrastructure and the challenges that the RISCAPE project faces in this context. Like in any good matchmaking platform, you have to fill in a questionnaire. But in the case of this project, they interview you instead of making you fill a questionnaire to find out who does similar things as you do, but at the international level, and what you do, who you are, and how you do what you do. And the last but not least here, although it may sound as something we should take for granted, we had quite some discussion on the very definition and the use of common terminology. And we wondered whether it should be considered as a prerequisite for a successful matchmaking, i.e. a fully effective collaboration. I will leave you with this, and I hope I've been true to the richness of the exchange we had yesterday.
Thank you very much, Maud. And now we pass on the parallel session 2 on human resources in the development and use of research infrastructure. Please, Dr. Hergen. And if you think of questions, we understand that at the end of the whole report, there will be some time for addressing specific or general questions about ICRI. Please, Sabine.
Thank you very much. Do you hear me? Yes.
Yes.
Great. Well, I asked everyone to use the slides that we provided. I didn't. Because we had really great artists in our parallel session who just provided with a graphic recording a very nice overview of what was discussed. And parallel session 2, we discussed a key issue of research infrastructures, which are, of course, human resources, because you need researchers to use infrastructures, but you also need highly skilled people to operate research infrastructures. And I would like to point out a few key issues that were discussed. With regard to the mobility or the improvement of mobility of research infrastructure staff. One aspect that was presented by one of our speakers was the need, and there I want to refer to what the speaker before was hinting at, mapping and common use of terminology. Because one of the recommendations was a competency framework and skill set that is research infrastructure specific, and transparent recruitment procedures, as well as transparent and visible work conditions and standardized remuneration scales and staff benefits, because this might help to foster mobility of research infrastructure staff, as we also saw from the discussions, that for researchers or users, the mobility is already very well established. We have, of course, also very different kinds of research infrastructures in the research infrastructure landscape, and we took a closer look at this. We looked at DARIA, a pan-European digital research infrastructure for arts and humanities, who I liked the quote very much, and I want to tell you this here, who looks for the right people wherever they are. And with regards to employment conditions, DARIA is not a direct employer. It has a very small number of core staff, but it has a quite significant and impressive number of stakeholders and users. What was mentioned here was we also need to promote skills, and we need specific skills. We had another presentation with regard to how to foster or give incentives for mobility of research infrastructure staffs by EMBL. And there we were told that in order to really foster the mobility of the staff, the work contracts most of the work contracts are for a limited time. And within this time that the research staff spends at the institution, at the research infrastructure, the work conditions are very competitive, and there is a real stress on training and the skills. Before we look at this side of the skills development, I want to stress maybe one of the major obstacles to staff mobility. And there we had a really nice presentation on the ReSaver pension scheme. It is a pan-European pension fund for researchers, but not just for researchers, also for research staff, that offers security and that makes international research careers more sustainable. It is a problem for everyone moving, especially for fellows or for researchers, moving from one country to another. And by securing pensions or not really stick people to vested times or pension rights, by being able to move them from one country to another, you really you take a really big burden away from research staff and from researchers. So this is a very, very important aspect, and it was really great that someone from ReSaver presented on this. Now I would like to report a little bit on the skills development. We heard already at EMBL, skills development is very important. As some of the speakers before were mentioning data management skills, we also heard a very, very nice and interesting example of a university that is appointing data stewards, and that really created a profile for data stewards or data management experts who really bridge the gap between researchers and research staff. Following this presentation, actually, and also discussions on managerial skills that especially researchers or scientists that operate or head research infrastructures need, It was also discussed that within a research infrastructure, there is not just research, there are really like research data management, other key skills that really merit our attention and that are really important and should not be neglected. Like this, I would like to end the short presentation that highly skilled staff is really important at the whole life cycle of a research infrastructure. And it's really research, operation of a research infrastructure and management. You will get more details, but maybe not such a nice picture in the report that will follow the conference. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Sabine. And now we will have the report on the parallel session number 3. That was about fostering diversity and overcoming inequality in the development and use of research infrastructure. Friedrich, please.
Thank you very much, Giorgio, for the introduction. So now I have a more standard presentation using the template, so it's going to be interesting to catch your attention. As you see, the titles of all the sessions are quite different, but we touch on topics which are very similar across those sessions. And I will show you also in these sessions how we also touched on topics which were already previously discussed, and that will be also reported by the next rapporteur. So first, we had something very different. We had a World Cafe, and we wanted to foster diversity in the World Cafe. It was interesting, it was very lively, and as you can see, we have a format which talk about cafe, and we skip voluntarily the cafe. So it's an important thing to tell you how people were engaged. We had 2 speeches to set the scenes, one from Thailand and one from Sweden. And I would really recommend you to go to the ICRI website, go to the PS3 sessions and look at the background of the 2 speakers. It's very different, and that's really helped in the discussions that we had at the tables. We had 4 round tables, each one with a chair. So I thank them for moderating the discussions at those tables and reporting at the end to the main chair of the session. Question of diversity, which was one important point. We had only 25 participants, but 22 were Europeans. So here we have to do a bit of effort at the next ICRI to enlarge regionally the participation. However, we did pretty good for ICRIs, representation on infrastructure, single-sited, distributed, in the fields attached to those ICRIs. And one of the difficulties to ensure that if you have a social scientist in one table that is not overwhelmed by 4 other physicists, or vice versa. So the diversity at the table is very, very important. Of course, the title of the session is about building bridges, but in order to build those bridges, you should better know the shores on which you're going to build those bridges. And for that, those shores here are cultural, political, and also scientific. So in order to help the discussions at those tables, we had laid out 10 initial questions. You have here an example of 4 of those questions, which I'm not going to come across, but I'm going to use the findings, or the preliminary findings of those sessions, of those questions, and then present that to you. So some of the findings that will recoup what has been said previously and what will be said very probably also in the next report, where that diversity actually improves knowledge and science. However, we also heard for Carlos Moedas yesterday that increasing diversity open to the world is important, open access is important, but we have to be careful in the way we do it. Of course, we all put excellence as a background. However, in the discussions also I came across that excellence in some ways on the VRI might not be that important. For example, you can have an RI in a very far remote place in the world, and his duty or its duty for this RI is to gather quality data. And from this quality data, then you can have scientific excellence coming out from other parts of the world. So this is why I put this, there's a weight on it. The access to RI is well organized. It is very important that you don't have free riders. Some of these RIs are expensive. If you only judge on scientific excellence, then why should you pay, right? If people are good, they're going to have use of this RI. So here we have to also be a bit careful on the way we open the RIs to the world. It is important that this reciprocity is also satisfied. Very importantly, a political stand may limit the diversity in having a mobility of researchers and access to RI. Different parts of the world have different ways of doing, so here science diplomacy, or diplomacy in science as it was said, Karl Moschda's session, is really of importance. Another things we touch about brain drain. Very clearly, we sometimes imagine brain drain as being researchers going from one place and being swallowed by another RI. But there's also the brain drain inside a country by other actors, or economical actors, the banks, the industry. So as much as this knowledge transfer is absolutely essential, if you want to keep developing your science, you must build enough capacity, such as a young researcher of today, in 20 years, are the professors and the teachers of tomorrow. We have to accept that not all differences can be bridged. That's okay. You have to respect and you have to play with it. And finally, here I've got one recommendation. I guess that was a diversity, 22 European countries, 22 European representatives at this session, which recommended that the support from the EC funding to European RIs for opening to less developed communities are welcome, such that emerging countries can become also trendsetter in their region. The speech that we had from Thailand showed that. So here I put that in italic for the reason that you can put that also in other regions, transpose that into other regions of the world. You can put that to the North American. It will have support from North American fundings to North American RIs, etc., etc. So on that, that's some of the first findings that we have, and we will have more in the report. And I would like to thank you for your attention, and I would like to thank also the creativity that I've seen on the tables of this World Café.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Now we will listen to the report on the fourth parallel session that was on the enhancing the societal value of research infrastructure. And Philippe Froissart is giving the report.
Thank you, Giorgio. Good morning. My duty is to present to you this morning the outcome of session 4 that took place yesterday. That session was about enhancing the societal value of research infrastructures. We had as moderator Francisca de Jong from Clara and Eric, and there were two rapporteurs, Frédéric Sgard from UOCD and myself. So this session was actually very long. It lasted the whole day, and it was broken down in 4 subsessions. The first subsession that I'm going to present to you it was about assessing the societal value of research infrastructures. We had there 3 speakers that were involved and that made presentations, Vincent Mangematin, Laura Hillier, and Alistair Reid. And the main issues that were addressed and came out from the discussion, first of all, is a statement, the fact that societal value of research infrastructures is complex to assess. That should not come as a surprise to you. And the reason for that is that it's a subjective notion which includes and implies the need to address and assess intangible assets. When it comes to identification and use of key performance indicator or core impact indicators, it's clear from the discussion that took place in this session that one size does not fit all research infrastructures, all types of research infrastructures that can be assessed. And when it comes to the model that need to be developed to assess the societal value of research infrastructures, it needs necessarily to include a quantitative aspect as well as a qualitative aspect. The impact assessment framework that can be used to assess the value of research infrastructures, the societal value of research infrastructures, cannot be too prescriptive either. And it's therefore necessary to have a flexible approach when using this assessment for the societal value of research infrastructures. What was very clear from the discussion that took place again was that the societal value depends on the objective or the core missions of the research infrastructures and of the perspectives of the stakeholders, depending who you address and who you want to target as end users. That may be policymakers, funders, users, public at large. The societal value of research infrastructures may also result from a cumulative effect. That means that it builds up as time goes by during the operation and the lifetime of the infrastructures. And the assessment that you will make of the societal value of the research infrastructures will only be done and provides a snapshot at a given timeline during the life cycle of the research infrastructures. Two ongoing and connected initiatives, and I insist on the word connected initiatives, were presented that were launched by OECD and AEC in the frame of the project RI Path that we are supporting in Horizon 2020. And they were considered to be very excellent initiatives that should be followed up, as they will provide modular tools in the future to assess impact of research infrastructures, and we hope that they will be used in the upcoming activities that will take place as regard the monitoring of the research infrastructures, for instance, in the case of ICRI. I'm looking at Giorgio in that configuration. The second session that we had was about enhancing the societal value of research infrastructures. And there we had 4 speakers, Anne Gauthier, Mei-Yun Kwon, Tim Keenan, and Xiaoming Jiang. A number of issues were discussed, and what came very clearly from the beginning of the discussion is that when it comes to enhancing the societal value of research infrastructures, investment matters, as well as communication. But societal value of research infrastructures, in order to be enhanced and to be considered fully, needs to be addressed at the very design phase of the research infrastructures. Enhancing the societal value of the research infrastructures requires a number of activities, and for instance, the ability or the capacity from the research infrastructures to convey complex information to targeted stakeholders. And there are a number of examples were provided in specific presentations, like for instance, the use of very specific data visualization, teaching and training aspects, as well as the use of intermediary organizations in order to convey the societal value of the research infrastructures. Enhancing the value of the research infrastructures requires also strengthening social trust. That is very much linked to the accountability of the research infrastructures to the public and proactive involvement of these research infrastructures in activities for a better society. It was also thought that the value of research infrastructures can be enhanced by the integration of these research infrastructures from the beginning into the local ecosystem. Then in a number of presentations, measures for enhancing the societal value were presented and included, for instance, providing greater access to the public as well as enhancing scientific literacy. The third subsession that we had in that panel was about the communication, communicating the value of research infrastructures to the public, to policymakers, and to various sectors of society. We had 3 speakers addressing these aspects: Andrew Smith, Amy Bilton, and Pierre Normand. There was a first consideration that was made in that panel by the speakers and also by the audience later on when we had the roundtable discussion, is that there is a general trend that we can observe towards more communication that are being done by the research infrastructures to reach out to the users, to the funders, and to the public. And not only systematically to the funders, but also to the public. And this is certainly a trend that is being observed now more and more in the landscape of research infrastructures. Communication that is being done by the research infrastructures must be adapted to the targeted group, and therefore should take into account the end user perspective and the psychology. That point was made explicitly when it came to communication to policymakers and funders. I'm I should say I'm not very much surprised by that, but it was certainly an interesting thing to mention. It was also mentioned that it was necessary to engage with user communities to articulate the added value of research infrastructures. A number of instruments of communications were presented. When it came to the public at large, examples were made of the use of use case or storytelling. And when it came to addressing specific sectors of the society, like for instance industry, examples were provided as the role of industry liaison officers that can made to engage with industry and reach out to industry players in order to broaden up the use of the infrastructures of the supply of products by industry to research infrastructures, the development and the use of portal for services, as well as dedicated events that can be organized in that context. It was thought to be important to create a two-way communication with the public, and in that context, the use of social media was raised as it offers new ways of communication and involves new areas of the public, like for instance the youngsters. Finally, a session on involvement of the citizens in the identification, development and use of research infrastructures. There we had 3 speakers, Jeon Chan-Young, Sarah Iverson and Giuseppe Simo. Number of issues were discussed there. In particular, the conditions for successful involvement of citizens in research infrastructures activities. Points were raised as the importance of bringing down barrier of communication, building trust. The word trust was used extensively in that session without surprise. And the fact that it is important in that context when interacting with citizens to recognize that local knowledge and ideas are key for the success of this interaction between researchers, research infrastructures, and citizens. Potential byproducts of this interaction were identified, such as scientific literacy and dissemination of results. When it came to trust, it was thought that it can be achieved through an early involvement of the citizens in the process of interaction. And then there were a number of examples that were provided on citizen science. It was stressed very clearly that citizen science is not about public outreach, and the examples that were provided illustrated that, such as the examples where citizens are used as an instrument to do science and help address, for instance, data deluge in astronomy. And what was stressed was that it was a two-way process in a sense that this is interesting for the research infrastructures to involve citizens in that context, but there is also a return from the citizens in a sense that they develop more learning, more knowledge, but they also can get more recognition or be even famous in some cases. Needless to say, like with the other session, much more was said and was discussed in that session. It was a very long, very intense session, excellent presentations, I should say, and I'm very much looking forward to these presentations being circulated to the participants by the organizers, because there was a lot of information that were there, and of course you will get much more in the report that will be compiled by the organizers and that will be following the end of this conference. On that note, I would like to thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you, Philippe. And we move on with the 5th parallel session that was on research, infrastructures, and data. And the 2 rapporteurs, Barbara and Kartagi, please.
Thank you. So the 5th breakout session was about research infrastructures and data. It was a very well-attended session. We also used an interactive tool to communicate more directly with the audience. And just to give you an impression of the participants, we had roughly 1/3 researchers, 1/3 came from research support organizations, and there was a smaller number of funders. So the whole topic was about trust and quality of data. And when we talk about trust, we have terms that are mentioned over and over again, which is data, metadata, control vocabularies, standards, and processes. So to talk about trust and quality means you need to have a deep understanding of what a digital object is. The FAIR principles can help to address these issues. There was a lot of discussion about metadata, rather the completeness of metadata, which means good documentation of provenance, timestamps, geographical scope, keywords, etc. When talking about trust and quality, the discussion of open data is fundamental. And openness in that case does not only mean open data, but also open software, open hardware, open algorithms. I mentioned already provenance. Provenance is key for the quality of data, for reusing data, but it's also the provenance chains, its preservation issues, and privacy. So these are the topics that seem to be more difficult and more challenging than the technical. Sensitive data is a big issue, and anonymization of data. And there was quite a discussion about anonymization, because anonymized data is key when it comes to cross-disciplinary exchange and the reuse data. But it was also discussed how the full meaning, how the full information within a data set can be maintained when anonymizing. The FAIR concept does not only apply to data, but of course to a broader ecosystem, which means it is also about quality of services, about functionalities and operations. Cybersecurity was mentioned quite a lot. The ability to access data, the interoperability of data and tools, machine actionable access and write models. And it was also discussed that it is necessary to develop researcher-centric data ecosystems, which means that archives and journals, CRIS systems, persistent identifier systems must also be taken into consideration. The challenges. On top of the list was the plethora of competing standards and communities. So it is generally perceived that not more standards should be developed, but we should rather build on existing standards. But on the other hand, it might be necessary to define new standards for new types of data, like social media data. When it comes to citizen science and citizen access, it must also be discussed what the amount of metadata should be for that. It is perceived that there is a gap between high-performance computing infrastructures and traditional repositories. There are some data that change in real time, so this requires snapshots, versioning, and a big discussion also, the ownership of data. We used our interactive system to do a little poll where the participants could choose between 3 options. They were asked what they think, who should own the data. Should it be the researchers themselves, the universities, or the universities, but with the mandate that the data is handed over to data stewards. And the clear majority chose the 3rd option. Multilinguality is also perceived as a challenge because this can be a topic that might turn out very cost-intensive. Also the consequences of metrics, the abundance of data, the abundance of journals. The question is if non-designed data or big data is changing the game, changing the rules. To give you an outlook, some suggestions of the morning session. The first topic is already underway. There is already a change in the publishing culture, which means the article of the future is not the PDF anymore. the sole PDF, but there is much deeper access to knowledge now, interlinked with code and data, images. It's necessary to bring together science and society expectations. So that means include stakeholders in strategic discussions. There's a trend of clustering data. We have to develop models on domain-agnostic data. And there was quite a lot of discussion on how can good data sets be promoted, how can they be shared, how can they be marked. And there were some visions, some visionary ideas, like using recommender systems, like Airbnb or TripAdvisor have them in place. So, to sum up, it's about adopting, adapting, and developing, and this refers to tools, support, and automated processes. Thank you.
So Barbara reported on the morning sessions, and I will give a quick report on the afternoon sessions. In fact, a lot of it was iterative, and issues that came up in the morning were repeated in the afternoon. And that was kind of deliberate. We started with principles, then we went into examples, and that was in the morning. Then in the afternoon, we focused more on the ecosystem, the role of cyber infrastructure, etc. And then we had a session with funders or policymakers. Because all of this was done after the dinner last night, we haven't completely coordinated, but we've tried to cut out so there's not too much duplication. And as you already have seen from the morning, it was a very rich session. So in terms of the ecosystem, we need to think about the data, the cyber infrastructures, and the connections between them. We need open object identifiers are actually critical for this, critical also for tracing provenance, and in the end also for both accessibility and accessibility. We need to think in terms of the whole research data life cycle. To some extent, FAIR just focuses at the end once you've got the data, and we need to think upstream of that at the researcher level in terms if we're thinking quality and trust in the data. We need open tools and software for connecting between these different areas, between different fields. We need to focus on user needs. Users being both the scientific community, but also more broadly for different types of data. And then there's a lot of best practices across different domains with different levels of preparedness. We heard from the astronomers who have their own data very well organized. We heard from social sciences and medical sciences, which were at a different level of familiarity with dealing with some of the big data challenges, and yet both sides can learn from each other. That became very obvious. Then we had a discussion about Google and Co. So there were two discussions about the commercial sector. One was in terms of openness and charging and access, and should we have different conditions for the commercial sector compared with the public sector. And there, going back to what was said in the initial plenary, part of the whole objective of open science is actually to encourage innovation. And so there was felt that really openness should be open for everyone when it comes to data. But then there's another issue about the actual data processing, management, and ownership, where Google and the other big .com companies, also I think some of the big publishers, they're both driving the field, and also there are some potential negatives about that. This was very timely because just 2 weeks ago, in fact, Google came up with a new, if you like, minimal metadata standards for searching for research data on the web, and that is going to really change the way, in terms of accessibility. Someone even said the accessibility challenge or discovery challenge is now dealt with. Google have dealt with it. But it also means de facto they set the standards that everyone else has to follow, and there are issues around that. So Google is providing solutions for storage and access to computing, and that meets a real need for science at the moment. As well as the discovery challenge, the semantic web, we heard that community in academia had been working on this for years, and then Google came along, and in a few months they really changed the field completely. So that's all very positive. But then the buts, and the buts are not necessarily negatives, but they're potential negatives. So we know in terms of skills, Google and co are they're attracting a lot of the skilled data scientists that we need in academia. We need them everywhere, but they go in often to these companies, and they pay huge salaries, and it's hard to compete with that. I say that they set the standards, and there's a threat that the public competitors, the public providers, might actually be driven out by the efficiency and the scale and the speed of what is happening in the dot-com companies. And then there's real issues about the long-term sustainability of that and customer dependency. I suppose you could take a parallel to some extent with what happened with the human genome, where the public and private were competing. And at one stage, the public could easily have given up and just said, let the private sector run with this. And where would we be now? And we don't know how this will work out, but we need to think about the goods and the bads. Certainly, all these things that Google is doing, it is doing at the moment with academic partners, and that's important, and building those relationships is important. The funders' perspectives and the issue of competition. It was interesting with the online poll tool, we asked, there was a multiple choice question about what should funders be doing other than funding? What is the most important thing they can do? 70% of the audience mentioned incentives and mandates. They see that as a critical function for funders. It was clear from the funders that open data and data sharing are different things, and we often use them interchangeably, and we need to think carefully about which we really want in which situation. This issue of balancing national benefits, spillovers, and international cooperation is a really serious issue that we often avoid. So in the end, certainly from a Treasury perspective, from a policy funding perspective, the question is, what am I going to get out of this in my country? And when we have issues like countries providing lots of data but not necessarily having the capacity to use that, whether that be hardware or personnel, the question for them is who's going to use the data they provide and what are they going to get back out of it? And so there's real issues about this balance between providing and being able to use. Ultimately, it's clear that we've just got too much data, and we're going to have to think about how we triage this, what of it is really useful to make open, what needs to be kept, and what can we actually dispose of or let go. And we need to think, as was said earlier, through the whole data life cycle, and not just once it's in the repository, but before that as well. Data management plans were stressed as an important tool. It was also acknowledged that no one likes data management plans, but they were felt to be an important tool to help the culture change that is needed. So it's all about data, but it's not just about data. It's about people, it's about software, it's about tools, it's about different types of infrastructures coming together. And I'll leave it at that.
Thank you. Thank you very much to all the rapporteurs for these important messages that try to summarize the exchange of knowledge and ideas. So I would say science is about producing, pursuing, and reaching new knowledge. Data is a piece, is an instrument in the path to reach new knowledge. And we have time now for some comments or questions from the audience. Please, I think we are organized with microphones so that you may introduce yourself briefly and then please.
My name is Werner Kutsch. I'm the Director General of ICRI. I was a few minutes too late, so I don't know whether you did this in the beginning. But I want to give the audience a very big applause to the session conveners. They did really an excellent job. I have never been on a conference where the session conveners were so efficient in their own preparation, but also in preparing the speakers and organizing the session. So a very, very big thank you to them.
This was a comment about ICRI and the great organization that was set up this time. What about on the issues that were summarized? Please, over there.
I had a question on definition of data. So in science, the gold standard is reproducibility. So when we publish a paper, we put the raw data into an open repository, but we also, for reproducibility, have to supply the software that did this, as well as intermediate data products. And I'm kind of curious, when you talk about data and interoperability, are you just restricting that to the raw data or the entire chain that's needed to reproduce the scientific results in the publications?
Thank you for this question, Carter.
So the chair of the data session, Michelle, is actually from the software carpentry background. And very much the session was about data and software combined. That came up very clearly at the outset. That certainly in terms of reproducibility, if you don't have the software, then and other information as well. So yes, software and data. Most times when I said data, I meant data and software.
Thank you. Any other panelists want to add on this? If not, are there more questions, suggestions? Organization of this ICRI is perfect, but they did not provide sunglasses for the people who is on stage. So I hardly see. Somebody was asking here. Oh, please,
yeah.
Please.
Okay. My name is Jan-Marco Müller from the International Institute for Applied Systems Analysis. I wanted to get back to the issue about researchers' mobility. I've lived in the last 15 years in 5 different European countries, so I know what mobility means. And what I noticed, what hindered me the most, it was not the tax systems, it was not the pension systems, it was not the schooling of the kids. All this is important, but it could be solved. But what has cost most of my time is that the HR department of the infrastructure in country A was not able to talk to the HR department of the infrastructure in country B. Because the one says, you have to use this template, and the other says, you have to use that template. So what I would like to see is when we talk about researchers' mobility, that we also talk about the mobility of researchers, administrators, and support staff. I would like to see our HR, finance, legal department go for a few weeks to visit their colleagues in another country in their infrastructure, just to see that there are different ways of doing things, and also to train their linguistic and intercultural skills.
Thank you, Sabine. Please.
Yes, your point is noted. A very good comment. This might be, we will take it, of course, as a suggestion into the report. The more we learn and the more we move and see how other people, how other organizations work, the better it is. It's also within a country. It's not just across borders. And the lighter bureaucracy is, I understand, for researchers, the easier it is to decide where to go and where to move. But thank you again for your comment.
Thank you. I think in that session, the concept of staff exchange programs has been mentioned. This is an old instrument, but if it was broadly used, I think it would produce at a different level of organization a better understanding of each other's methods. Please.
It was a nice discussion during the skills session, and possibly maybe not everyone was catch on the big graphics, but it was discussion about skills, how to manage, how to create, sustain. And if infrastructure can exist without industry, without universities, skills creation and management cannot be done this. You need to put into this ecosystem universities, industry for different purposes, for education, for career management. And industry also has a big experience of managing competences and skills. And this was commented during the session. Such framework, this a European e-competence framework, were a good example that Elixir infrastructure, research infrastructure, reuse this to create their competence framework for managers and for actual researchers. So this should be mentioned, and specifically mentioned that cooperation with academia, universities, and this industry for best experience and for implementation.
Thank you. Anybody wants to pick that up?
Thank you again for mentioning this. I didn't mention it in the brief overview, but yes, thank you. And of course, it will go into the report. And you are absolutely right that research infrastructure management can learn a lot from industry. This might merit more closer attention and maybe even a topic at the next ICRI. Thank you.
Please, I saw somebody over there.
Tiberius Ignau from Scientific Knowledge Services. It was reported in session 4D, citizens used as instruments to do science. I warmly invite to reconsider rephrasing this. Citizens don't think they like to be used as instruments to do science, probably to be participants in doing science. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
If I may
remark taken.
Giorgio,
yes?
If I may say.
Yes, please.
Since I was unfortunately the rapporteur of the session,
no.
and I am the one who actually wrote those words, I think, to be fair, I took them verbatim from the speaker. But I agree with you, it's probably better that we reformulate this sentence, and in the report we will be a little bit more careful than what I was doing when presenting the outcome of that session.
Thank you very much. Philippe, Tiziana.
Does it work? Yes. I have a question for the rapporteur of the international collaboration track. Was the idea of giving structure to international collaboration through a road mapping activity ever discussed in your track? So, for example, leveraging the experience of ICRI within Europe and having roadmaps within Europe, and also the results of the RESCAPE project, which I think you've mentioned in your report. Wouldn't a road mapping activity which defines the work to be undertaken across different infrastructures in the world something which would give structure and a framework for infrastructures to collaborate and pave the way for their collaboration in the future?
So the short answer is no. The road mapping exercise, as you described, was not discussed. What was discussed is indeed the international mapping of RIs, such as in the context of the RESCAPE project. That could be considered as an initial step in that process. But I think we may have kept away from that because it could deserve another full session to discuss the matter.
Thank you.
Thank you. More questions or comments from the audience? I don't see at the moment. Let me make a quick consideration, personal. I think this ICRI conference has shown that there are concepts around research infrastructure that are becoming solid knowledge of the scientific community as well as the political decision makers, and that it's about the scope of infrastructure, it's about access, this concept of merit-based access to infrastructure, that is one of the points in the GSO framework, is broadly understood because scientists are broadly motivated in very much in the same way all around the world, and that reflects on policies. And when we manage to formulate clearly what are the needs, this percolates the whole global ecosystem, I would say, of the research infrastructures. And then all the other aspects that were dealt with in the different sections show, let me say, a very quick advance towards maturity of the full understanding and definition of research infrastructures. We also have a similar good understanding of the e-infrastructures. This is, again, well described, understood how could be well managed, and that is also an asset that keeps evolving, but with very clear understanding. What is, to my feeling, still a little gray zone with much interest and expectation, but that requires more thinking and precision, is data. Data is a little mantra that hides different understanding. Data can go from, let's say, the scientist point of view that understands a structured data set, not yet translated into a science paper because maybe there is not yet the interpretation work, but that is a self-contained, structured data set that is information that can develop into knowledge if somebody works on that. And so the interoperability, the accessibility, the availability of tools to work on structured data sets is one of the understanding. Sometimes understanding is just a little generic. Technologies to move around and to make accessible to storage, to preserve for a long time, data as something that is less connected with the preparation of information for knowledge process. And we should try to deepen, I think, our understanding to make the two tools, data production at science production at research infrastructure, data transfer, access, support by the e-infrastructure, and the object that is transferred from back and forth from one of the infrastructure to the other as a better and better understood object, which for the moment, in my opinion, is not entirely common understanding. So, having said that, I think this conference was extremely useful. The series of ICRI's conference, I think, is also maturing, and every new edition gives a more comprehensive picture of the state of the art, or where we are in our understanding and our development of the research infrastructure. So I think we will remain with very good memories of this ICRI 2018, with lessons and stimulating discussions that we take home. And we will also remain with a big question mark, but life is like that. Did Carlos get the taxi? And if so, which one of the two? So we are kindly invited by the organizers to have a coffee in the next hallway.
Good? All right, I think we're ready to start this final session. So the finishing line is close. Again, it's a pleasure to be with you, and it's a pleasure to see you, so many in the room. So again, my name is Marilyn Fiaschi. I'm the Managing Director of Science Business, and I'm going to call the speaker straight away on stage, and while you're coming up, I will introduce you. So for this final session that is very much about wrapping up and design a way forward with regard with research infrastructures, we will be joined by 6 speakers, so starting with Wolfgang Böttcher, Deputy Director General at DG Research and Innovation at the European Commission. Wolfgang, thank you for joining us. I know you landed not long ago, so your presence here is much appreciated. Then Michal Ramanovsky is Director of the Department of State for Scientific, Technological and Innovation Policy at the Russian Federation. Thank you, Michal. Coming from the United States, Paul Dabar, you're Undersecretary for Science at the Department of Energy. United States, welcome. Shumete Gizau, State Minister of Science and Technology from the Federal Democratic Republic of Ethiopia. Shumete, welcome. Going back on the other side of the Atlantic, Roseanne O'Reilly Runte, you're President and CEO of the Canada Foundation for Innovation. Roseanne, thank you for being with us. And finally, well, 2 more speakers, Vinnie Pillet, who's very bravely replacing Dan Dutrois. Vinnie Pillet is Senior Science and Technology Representative at the Department of Science and Technology, South Africa. And finally, our host, that I don't need to introduce anymore, so Barbara Weizgeber, from the Ministry of Education, Science and Research, Austria. So, 5 countries on stage, plus the European Commission. I was told there are 59 countries represented in the audience, and I will set the rules of the game for this final panel. We have 6 speakers here. We have 5 countries represented and the European Commission. You are all invited to take part in this final panel. So the way we will proceed is that we will take a bit of altitude. We heard about the summary and the conclusions from the different parallel sessions. With this panel, we want to set recommendations on how to move forward with research infrastructures in your countries and at the international level. So we will start, I will ask each speaker a few questions. Then we will go into smaller discussions, and here you will have to do a bit of exercise because you will come here at the high tables. Those high tables are meant to make the world better and to make the research infrastructures better. So we'll go into smaller discussions here. You will be invited to join the discussion, and then you will give me your final recommendations. Does that work with all of you? Great. Okay. So let's kick off. Okay, you can stay here for the time being. Wolfgang, I will kick off with you. So as I said, you just landed, so I'm not going to ask you to summarize the conference. But let me ask you a very simple question. From the European Commission perspective, do you think research infrastructures can really be a game changer in terms of international cooperation?
I think we all agree that research infrastructures are key for excellent research, for excellent science, for the advancement of knowledge. So it's a key condition to be competitive in a globalized world. And I think all here together support for research infrastructures. But I've listened very carefully to the conclusions this morning, and I have one thought about these conclusions. And this thought is that if you have listened to all these speakers, there are big new challenges ahead for research infrastructures in terms of data management, data availability, but also in terms of opening research infrastructures to other stakeholders, to the industry, to citizens, to stakeholders. And these new challenges will not be without costs for research infrastructures. And I think as we are here together, the question of long-term sustainability of research infrastructures remains on our agenda, in particular in the light of all these new challenges. And I think research infrastructures will be a game changer if we, and this is what we try to do at the European level, respect certain elements. I think we cannot compromise on the excellence of research infrastructures. This should not exclude, as somebody has mentioned this morning, that research infrastructures also play an important role in terms of development in emerging countries. But the overall objective should be excellence of research infrastructures, and we cannot compromise. I think the second element on which we have really to work hard if we want to be a game changer is the interaction with business, with industry, but also with the end users and the citizens. And I know that this is much easier said than done, because we are used to this talk to involve citizens and business. But one thing is to talk about it, and another thing is to do it. This is why for research infrastructures, both the involvement of business but also the involvement of citizens will be a big challenge. But I'm convinced that in particular the interaction with business will be decisive for the long-term sustainability on the one hand, but also for the excellence and the innovation performance of research infrastructures. And I think thirdly, and that is related to this, is evidently we have to go towards better performing research infrastructures, and therefore the monitoring, as it has been singled out by one of the group, is very important. Also regarding societal achievements, because talk to policymakers about research infrastructures, and they are certainly not aware of the added value of these research infrastructures in terms of producing societal values. So I think it is very important also with respect to the long-term sustainability that we treat this issue. My last point, but maybe we can discuss this further later, is just one rapporteur talked about, when it came to data, about the plethora of standards. And I really think this discussion about data availability and making data fair, findable, accessible, interoperable, and reusable is a key challenge in many respects. But it's a key challenge, and I think the plethora of standards shows it. It's a key challenge for all of us, be it in Europe or at the international level, in terms of governance. Who do we bring around the table to set the framework conditions and the rule for the fair data access. And I think at least at the European level with the Open Science Platform now and related governance mechanism, we try to bring together all those who are involved. Member states, funding organizations, research community, researchers, and stakeholders. But this is not an easy exercise, because if somebody is not around the table, he immediately raises his hand, and why not me? And I think the challenge is already a big one at the European level, but evidently it's a big challenge also on the worldwide scale and on a global level, to have the right people around the table to design this framework. Somebody talked about grassroots, certainly extremely important, but what is the role of the public authorities in this respect? So I think these are very important questions. I was long, sorry about that, but I will refrain now.
No, that's very good, thank you. Maybe just one more short question. What is the role of the European Commission actually in setting guidelines or standards in terms of international cooperation for research infrastructures? You mentioned the question of governance around the question of data, and indeed this is one thing that we will discuss afterwards. But at a broader level, what's the responsibility of the European Commission in that regard?
At the broader level, I think, as our Commissioner has already explained yesterday, I think we in Europe are quite proud that we have a kind of best practice in terms of delivering synergies for research infrastructures. We have the European Science Forum for Research Infrastructures, who has done a great job to ensure added value and synergies and complementarities of research infrastructure in Europe. But even in an integrated place like Europe, this is a very complex issue because, again, you have all these actors and you have to bring them around the table. So this is not an easy task. But then the question is, what do we do on the international level in this respect? And I think the first statement is, and because that was also raised this morning, are we open to cooperation on the level of research infrastructures on a worldwide scale? And I think we are. I know that there are, and this has been raised this morning, competition issues, question of competitiveness, of competition, but I think our Commissioner has indicated we are open to the world, and this also applies to research infrastructures cooperation. But one thing is to be open, one thing is to have the corresponding funding tools, but the other thing is to organize it. What is the forum in which you organize this kind of cooperation of research infrastructures at the worldwide level? We have the group of senior officials who very carefully looks at this kind of possibilities, as it has been raised, mapping, possibilities of complementarity of research infrastructures, but evidently this is pure voluntary cooperation at international level. We take this very seriously, but this is the state of art at this point in time, in fact.
Very good. So, Michael, can I come to you now? Do you want just very, very briefly, just describe a little bit the landscape of research infrastructures in Russia? How does it work?
Okay.
And what are the major ones that we should know about?
No, you know that collaboration with European and other world countries with Russia scientists characterized by a very large scale for cooperation, beginning, I don't know, from individual science to small groups, laboratories, and of course in huge facilities. And there are several, maybe more than fingers on this left hand, nice examples of collaboration with international infrastructure, like Big Hadron Collider in CERN, DAISY facility in Hamburg, Grenoble synchrotron source, and so on and so on. But of course, the interesting question, what infrastructure can be used for international cooperation in Russia, of course.
Yeah.
And it's known you see. First of all, I should say about the the constructed collider for heavy ions in Dubna, and not far from Moscow, and the neutron source in Gachina, not far from St. Petersburg. As well as this, there are several other infrastructures like tokamak in Moscow region igniter, the characterized the new physics. It's not necessary to heat plasma in this tokamak, so it's an automatic process. The center for extremely high laser fields in Nizhny Novgorod, and so on. You see, and maybe part of them, for example, the facility for extremely high light source in Nizhny Novgorod can be involved in, for example, ELICA operation in Europe, or as well as in Laser Lab Europe, and this is maybe good examples.
So what's the role of these national research infrastructures in attracting non-Russian researchers? How does it work?
No, for example, I don't know, the light source in Nizhny Novgorod, now it's on the level of other facility in all over the world. There are about maybe 10 facilities on the same level, but it's absolutely clear how to upgrade this device to maybe 2 order of magnitude, and it's possible to weight new physics on this facility. Maybe not right now, but in the nearest future.
Do you have an idea of what the proportion of non-Russian researchers using those facilities?
Yes, that's right.
All right. Paul, may I come to you now? So, can I just ask you why you're here? Why did you accept these invitations? What were your goals in attending this conference?
Yeah, no, great. First of all, I'd like to thank Austria and the European Union on putting this together. I'd like to thank the European Union for the history of the scientific community from 150 years ago and 100 years ago, and I think everyone in the world benefits from the culture that has been created here and is certainly maintained here around the scientific community. The first point that I was here to do was to communicate about where the U.S. is in terms of research and science, which I'll comment to. The second thing is to listen. And I think a lot of the themes that I heard yesterday about reciprocity and about access and about transnational points is all very consistent with what we see every day. And then thirdly is to communicate very strongly that we are very strong about open access and want to take a look at the next generation of research infrastructure and user facilities about how do we partner with the rest of the world, with what we're about to start building on, learn about whatever everyone else is looking to build, and where we can partner on building those together. So those are the three primary areas. Let me comment to the first one, which is, I think most people know, the footprint of the United States, but it is pretty large in terms of the scientific community. My area that I run the National Labs system for the United States. So the National Lab System, I think, is very well known here, but it's Stanford SLAC, it's Lawrence Berkeley, it's Lawrence Livermore, it's Oak Ridge, Argonne, Fermi National Lab. It's a large list. And run all our different areas associated with imaging and light sources, high energy particle physics, nuclear physics, fusion, high performance computing, genomics. It's a long list. Okay. Our budget is about $34 billion a year. The research component to it across all the different areas that we cover across our national labs is approximately $28 billion a year.
Public money.
Yeah, it's reasonably large. And There are a lot of exciting big ideas that we're working on. I'll stop, but a number of big areas that we're focused on in terms of allocating those dollars and find things that are that we can work on together, across the globe.
So you mentioned that you have a number of partnerships and with other countries. What do you find more challenging throughout these partnerships?
Yeah, having spent a lot of time with Europe over my career, I'm sympathetic to the challenges that the European system has to do to coordinate. And a lot of the points that were raised over the last couple of days around open access and funding and sustainability of funding is actually not a challenge for the United States because we're a single entity. We fund everything. We assume we pay for everything. It's relatively straightforward. And we have open access, associated with it based on merit. Any place in the world, anyone in the world can come and do access. What we find, I find particularly interesting is we have a long list of research areas that we want to continue to push forward on. I have a long list of research infrastructure facilities that I know that we want to do. We have great history in the world. In particular, I'll pick off two. Obviously, the Large Hadron Collider and CERN is a great example of European leadership where we have provided equipment to the detectors. And with the upgrade currently, we think that has been a wonderful history. The second one in the United States, which is ongoing right now, which is Long Baseline Facility, Neutrino Facility at Fermi National Lab, where we're the lead, obviously, but we have a long list of supporters around the world who are providing in kind. Italy, France is going to India, a large number of countries, where it's kind of the other way around. And so figuring out how we build on those with a pipeline of research infrastructure that we see that other people are looking at doing and compare that to what we're looking at, such as the EIC Collider in the nuclear physics area or others, and how we can partner together on our respective research infrastructure.
Very good. I'll move to our Ethiopian friend. What do you think, or how do you think e-infrastructures can influence Ethiopia?
Yeah. Thank you very much. First of all, I would like to thank Austria, the Austrian Federal Ministry of Education, Science and Research. I've been trying to capture the many aspects of infrastructure and infrastructure from the presentations made here. It is actually difficult to talk about the infrastructures and the infrastructure as a whole, about the global south and the Ethiopia's infrastructure and the EU's stage, because there are so many advancements here with regard to e-infrastructure and research infrastructure. But as far as e-infrastructures in Ethiopia is concerned, is growing, is coming to being, but the infrastructure itself needs another basic infrastructure, like the telecom services, the communication services, the big data services, in general the IT services and its coverage. So
are you saying that the infrastructures are a prerequisite to be able to go to the next level for e-infrastructures?
Yeah, infrastructure itself need another basic infrastructure. So the infrastructure, for example, in Ethiopia, the school net, the WORDA net, the Ethernet, the IFMIS, that is the business and financial management system, all this needs another infrastructure. So they are concomitantly and going side by side, but still what has been done is not yet done. So Ethiopia should not only Ethiopia, but also the global south should follow up the footsteps of the global north, and partnerships and collaborations in this regard, I can see is very important. And regarding the implementation of the infrastructure. The three sectors, mainly the education sector, the research, and the government institutes, they are implementing the infrastructure, but the question of scale, speed, and quality is still there. So using the late cover advantage and creating more partnership at regional level and also at national level is very important in Ethiopia.
As the government sets objectives for the development of research infrastructures, is there a roadmap?
Yeah, there is a roadmap, as I have already indicated, for the basic infrastructure, like the VSAT and some other IPs, and for the fiber optics and the coverage, trying to distribute the telecommunication and the IT services here and there. The map is already there. The ICT map for the country is there, so that once the roadmap is in place, it's possible to fully implement the infrastructure for different sectors of Ethiopia.
And how much do you value working with others? Does Ethiopia work with the European Union on this matter?
Yeah, there are partnerships actually with the European Union, not only with Ethiopia, but also for the African, like the Open Science Platform Partnership, the research infrastructure partnerships. There are supporters, and then there are experience sharings and assistances from the EU, and also at regional level, the EU itself is facilitating this kinds of partnership with the EU and with different other countries in Europe.
All right, good. Roseanne, can I come to you?
Yeah.
I think by now Canada Foundation for Innovation is quite known, but do you want just to remind us what's the role of the foundation when it comes to research infrastructures?
The Canada Foundation for Innovation provides, with the support of the federal government, funding for research infrastructure for the universities, colleges, hospitals, and not-for-profit agencies across Canada, and provides ongoing funding for the 17 major science initiatives across the country, which include things like Snow Lab, telescopes, icebreakers.
All right. And, well, we touched upon the question of impact on society, and we heard, again, some important conclusions from the parallel session, but impact on society and the communications to the citizen is close to your heart and to the Foundation's objective. Do you want to tell us a little bit more on what Canada is doing?
I think the research infrastructure really does have an impact on communities and on people's lives. One example that I can give is the town of Waterloo, which was a small, sleepy, rural community, a farming community, where there was not much not many jobs for young people. And the CFI started with a grant to the Perimeter Institute, which was matched by private industry, the province, and other grants. And now the city of Waterloo, the mayor has come and said to me, look at this vibrant community with good schools, with good cultural activities, sporting activities, services for the population, a thriving area in North America where people want to come, live, and do high-tech jobs. Another example would be Sudbury in Ontario, which was a mining town and not very pretty, covered with coal dust. And with the investments in environmental research, the town worked with the researchers, and it has now won an award from the United Nations for being a transformed city. So those are two examples, but research infrastructure also provides scholarships and jobs for students, and inspiration for the next generation of scientists. We know that at Triumph they come for summer camps. In Perimeter Institute they come for competitions. And we heard yesterday at CERN that they do science for fun. So those are things that research infrastructures do to support the next generation. They also support the economy and research coming together and building networks. An example of that would be in Atlantic Canada, where research on the environment and on the fishery as a resource has created jobs and a whole network of community, business, and researchers working together to build a better environment for everyone. And I guess the final one is the economic impact. And economic impact could be very small. One could take the town of Sarnia, Ontario, where the Lambton College produced a coating for exercise equipment that was outside, and the coating was to help it weather the winter weather that we do have in Canada. And it made a business be successful. But you can also take big infrastructure like SNOLAB, which contributes, according to their last annual report, $338.6 million in economic impact. So it is an important impact for all communities, and I think this is true around the world.
You mentioned the importance of network. Who do you think are the intermediaries to deepen the impact on society in terms of communicating, in terms of mobilizing the community? What are the key ingredients? Who are the key organizations to communicate about this impact?
Well, I must say that the navigator at the Canada Foundation for Innovation brings together the research community and the businesses. But we have really wonderful science education programs, science for journalists, and we need the public to understand what we do. And there is, for example, in Canada, a network of researchers that every week publish their stories with the idea that the public will read them and understand better science. And so we won't end up with things like the fear of artificial intelligence, the fear of computational technology. Because I think when people don't understand something, they're sometimes afraid. They're afraid it will take their jobs. They're afraid that they will be run by robots. And they need to be reassured that actually there would not be robots if there weren't people. And as long as there are good researchers and good scientists, they will manage this intellectual contribution to society in a good way.
Okay. Vinny, can I come to you? So, South Africa, what are for you the biggest challenges in the field of research infrastructures? How would you like to move forward?
From South Africa's perspective, I think just taking a step back, we've tried to leverage on our geographic position. So one of the things we've tried to use in the development of the research infrastructures has been, for instance, southern oceans or the southern skies, Antarctic research, etc. I think the challenges that we face from the research infrastructure perspective is not new to anyone sitting in the room. I think throughout the 2 days we've heard some of these challenges being raised. Of course, within the context of South Africa, within the socio-economic context, it may be slightly different, but some of these very much focus on finding the real critical skills that are needed, not only to set up the research infrastructure, but also to ensure the operability and long-term sustainability. And of course, the other arm of resources is that of financial resources. How do you ensure that politically there's commitment and funding, not just from your national governments, but I mean, we all have fiscal constraints. We live in a fiscally constrained environment currently, whether you're in South Africa or anywhere else in the world. And I think it's also dealing with those sort of issues. And for South Africa, one of the things we'd really like to do is strengthen our innovation ecosystem. So from the perspective of how do you then use your research infrastructures to develop more your partnerships with industry, to develop the innovations that come out of your research infrastructures in this ecosystem. I think that's something we need to grow as well. So those are just the general challenges.
Very good. And so how do you plan to deal with those challenges?
Okay, so I mean, there's a few things I think we've already put in place, which has helped. I think working in collaboration with the European Union, for instance, we launched the South African Research Infrastructure Roadmap in 2016. And that's an important step because what it does, it collates a set of critical research infrastructures for the country, kind of prioritizes it in terms of different thematic areas. And then as government, it also links up with other ministries. So not just the Ministry of Science and Technology, but talking to other ministries in partnership in terms of how then do we go about supporting these critical research infrastructures. In terms of skills, I mean, there's a few elements. One of the critical elements has been something called the South African Research Chairs Initiative. And what it tries to do, and I think it's a model that's been copied from our Canadian colleagues, but what it tries to do is it tries to attract the best capabilities or experts from around the world, and it offers them a 5-year tenure at a South African university. And that time can be split in their home country and in South Africa. For instance, we have several research chairs in areas that are critical for the SKA. And it serves as a hub to train young and emerging scientists. But also we would like to focus on women and black researchers within the South African context. So those are some of the building blocks being put in place to help us with those challenges.
Very good. There are some important points in there, so we'll come back to some of them. But Barbara, well, Austria is a small country, but the capacity of reaching research infrastructures nationally or internationally are huge. So how do you select the research infrastructures that you work with?
Well, quite a complex question, but similar to South Africa, it's probably a similar process in all countries. Austria being in the heart of Europe, of course, we are well embedded in the European research area. So the European Strategy Forum for Research Infrastructure and the roadmap there is one of the reference points. And when choosing on which of the infrastructures we should take part in, of course the question is, do we have a strong enough national scientific basis, or is it an area where we want to build up such a basis? And of course, access, funding models, also governance models are very important issues. And for the distributed research infrastructures, the pan-European ones, we think it's very important that all EU countries participate, as these infrastructures are only as successful and valuable regarding the data as many countries are participating. Just to mention the European Biobanking Network, for instance, the more national centers are included, the more access there is to data samples, and coming to the social impact and societal impact, the better it is for future patients. So there's a very clear link to it.
Good. So what are the objectives from Austria moving forward? So ICRI is part of the presidency. Once the presidency is over, is there anything particular objectives that you want to share with us on how to move forward for the country?
Well, in general,
is there any specific research areas, for instance, that you're aiming to grow your research capacity?
As Austria has the overall aim of being one of the most competitive European Union countries, of course, research infrastructure is an important element of the European research area. So for the ICRI roadmap, which was launched at the beginning of this week during our presidency, of course, in close cooperation with the Austrian research community, we already do have several projects in mind where Austria will take part in. which then goes along with national strategies like the life sciences strategies or the strategic development of social sciences and humanities. So it's part of an overall picture. But also on the national level, what we try to do with the National Database for Public Infrastructure, which also has a part of collaboration, also including business and industry, is to make the best possible use of existing infrastructure and also to ensure that there is a coherence within the small country Austria is.
All right, thank you. I'd ask one question to each of you. Well, not to all of you, sorry. That's actually related to my last question to Barbara. What do you think are the research areas that are likely to benefit the most from research infrastructures? Where do you think research infrastructures can really influence advancement of research in a specific area, be it, I don't know, artificial intelligence or other fields? Who would like to give it a try? Paul, please.
So I'll hit on two, certainly two that we are very much investing a lot of in infrastructure right now. One is in our high-performance computing area. We put a lot of dollars into infrastructure on high-performance computing. We just commissioned the world's both fastest supercomputer at Summit at Oak Ridge, and it's the most powerful artificial intelligence machine in the world. Mm-hmm. And we ourselves, as well as reaching out to parties about trying to develop algorithms and applications and testing. It's a hybrid architecture with both GPUs and CPUs. And how do we take that hardware and how do we work with parties to basically find time on it to find some of the most complex problems, whether it's in high energy particle physics or in life sciences around cancer. And we're open for people to make proposals to use that. And then on top of that, we're building 3 new computers that are going to beat that one. So we have 3 more very large machines. We're about to announce the completion of our latest round, $1.8 billion for 3 new exascale computers. Once again, to drive artificial intelligence, work with partners who want to make proposals based on merit. The second area that we're about to...
Sorry, on the first area, what are the foreseen applications? Well, yes. Concretely, what do you think it can be used for?
Well, it's very broad, right? So I'll give a few examples. In artificial intelligence right now, the IIoT, or Industrial Internet of Things. So we're working with a broad range of both universities and our own national labs and industry on how algorithms can be developed for energy management, for grid management. We actually have a machine learning algorithm that can run a whole grid and dispatch power plants and basically, tell how to run a whole system of the United States and how to run. We actually have a little utility in which we've developed an artificial algorithm to run the whole grid. We've handed over a utility grid to an AI algorithm. Very small town, but the first time we've actually had AI hand over a whole utility system to manage. Third, life sciences is very large. For example, using image capture and GPUs in our system for identification of mitochondria, so brain cancer. Obviously, imaging and MRI scans and taking all the data from a particular person. We found that actually an AI algorithm that we've developed and run on our machines can be more accurate than a human in terms of identifying cancer. Just because it can see more images, it can review more, it can learn from it, and then make diagnoses. The list is long, but those are just a few examples.
Whoever wants to share his or her ideas. Vinny.
I think a very generic approach is actually looking, like my DG mentioned at the opening session, is the issue of sustainable development goals. And I think as countries, as signatories to the sustainable development goals, we could, for instance, say, what are we doing in the area of health or climate change, and try and work together to advance those. and get traction on that. I mean, in South Africa, for instance, there's a focus at the moment around setting up a genomic center, looking at things like precision medicine. The colleague has already mentioned energy. So you can pick out those areas where the socioeconomic value of the research infrastructures, I think, are quite tangible. So there's the supporting elements like data, etc., but how then do you derive the value from the data within the context of making an impact and the Sustainable Development Goals, I think is important.
Very good. Chumete.
Yeah. Yes, there are actually what I call the sector-based infrastructures. Depends on the priority areas of regions or countries. Our country has got roadmaps for technology. It's a national technology roadmap for different sectors. One of the roadmaps is the ICT, including the big data and the HPC, high performance computing, and the big data analysis for the country. And also the ICT facilities as a whole. And the other one is the biotechnology issues are already one of our focus areas because we need to feed our people, the food security and other issues are there. Energy is still in question. And the human resource capacity building in general, and particularly for science, technology, and innovation in order to run the research, education, and the e-governance systems is very important. So we're focusing on some priority areas, how to feed our people on biotechnology, and how to manage the data for different sectors, including the establishment of the big data analysis and high-performance computing. We are also trying to modernize the research ecosystem and the education platform with different aspects because the quality of education is now becoming in question. And so what's important is a human-aware development is still on focus. So these are some of the priority areas.
It's very interesting to see how research infrastructures, well, is really embedded into the country's priorities.
Yeah.
Wolfgang, did you want to come in or no? Then I suggest, or Rosanne, sorry, you wanted to come in. Please do.
I was just going to say that I think around the world we're all interested in artificial intelligence and high-performance computing, and we're interested in the Sustainable Development Goals. But I think that what is different now than was a few years ago is the fact that we're approaching problems in a truly interdisciplinary way, and that we're seeking a convergence of disciplines to solve the problems. And at the same time, we're looking at global problems, and we're looking at them from an international way of looking and working. And I think it's almost, we're standing on the edge of a new revolution. Not necessarily the technological revolution, but a revolution where minds around the world come together to solve problems, and where nations work together, and peoples and disciplines. And so that what's different and new and exciting is working together from a truly integrated way.
Yeah, just to follow that up, I think this more mission-oriented approach to research is actually linked to what you just said. And the good news is that the European Research Infrastructure Roadmap that was launched this week is also focusing on the interlinkages of the different infrastructures and the opportunities for the interdisciplinary research. And I think that's the way to go forward.
Very good. Barbara, keep the microphone. Would you mind coming here, actually, to our little policy lab to make the world better? And I will also ask Chumete and Michal to come here. I have one question for you, but I will also ask others to come in. The question I have for you three is, I want to have a little reality check here. In your country, does any researcher who wants to access research infrastructure actually can how can we make research infrastructure more inclusive? That's a question for the three of you.
Okay, yeah, may I start? Yeah, thank you very much. As I have already explained, research infrastructure needs to be inclusive. So access to research infrastructure for all the research communities is very important. But nowadays, the problem is that there are disparities, geographical disparities, rural-urban disparities, because of the coverage of the ICT infrastructure, because of the coverage of the telecommunication networks and facilities are there. And also disparities among the end users. Our end users are the education system stakeholders, the researchers, the research community, research institutes, and also the government institutes. So the inclusiveness actually decreases from the core to the periphery. And also the inclusiveness for end users, as far as universities is concerned, is different from generation of universities to generations. We have 4 generations of universities. The first generations are the oldest ones, and the 4th generations are the youngest ones. So we have about 20 years history of higher education development. So what we are expecting the higher education system, the higher education ecosystem, is to engage into research. So the inclusiveness is still very young. So what we need is to make it inclusive at country level and also at regional level, to expand our connectivity in the global south and also in the global north. So I strongly believe in the inclusiveness and the access to of researchers to the research infrastructure.
Very good. Barbara?
Well, I think one has to differentiate on the level of research infrastructure. Research-based higher education is, of course, linked to very basic infrastructure, and then that's available and open to all the students and all the staff. But when it comes to large-scale infrastructure, of course, access is merit-based, so there is a competition, and only those excelling in this competition, be it on a national or international level, will have the access to the large-scale infrastructure. But it's inclusive insofar as it's open to everyone, meeting the academic and scientific goals.
But it is large-scale infrastructures.
Yeah.
In this case, is there any specific initiative at the government level in Ethiopia to inform researchers about the existence of these large-scale infrastructures?
Yeah, there are so many initiatives to make it inclusive and to aware. Actually, the culture of infrastructure, research infrastructure in the country is not yet fully implemented. So it's a growing phase. So even the culture, the mindset of people, even researchers, are not in a position to engage themselves into research infrastructure. And so that culture building, as far as research infrastructure, particularly the infrastructure, is very important. At the same time, building the capacity of the researchers and then how to access, including the digital literacy, is very, very important. So that it's one thing to be a researcher, it's another thing to be digitally literate. So these are the things that we are focusing on.
All right. What about, how is it in Russia?
Okay. I think that the success of research infrastructure strongly depends on the dense tissue of all type of investigations in all over the world, maybe in this country. And for example, fundamental investigation on this point of view are strongly dependent on applied investigation, and then the industrial requirements and so on. And in fact, no, maybe the best situation right now is in the USA, and we should stream, yeah. So, for example, in Russia, we try to stream to organize good collaboration between among these several types of investigations, and basic research infrastructure from this point of view is absolutely necessary thing, you see.
Okay. So you mentioned the USA. Is it in a specific...
No, the most dense tissue of investigation are now in the USA, I'm sure.
Okay. Anyone wants to challenge that? Are there any questions from the audience to one of our three speakers? Is it possible to have a little bit more light in the room? Otherwise, we won't be able to see. Yeah, thank you. So would anyone like to come in at this stage? Maybe on the question of inclusiveness. There are so many countries represented in the audience. Would anyone like to bring a testimonial or ask a question to the speakers? Yeah? Okay, I really can't see. I don't think there are any questions. Do you see anyone? No? Okay, you're all very happy. Thank you very much. Thank you to the three of you. And we'll move to the next question. And the next, yeah, you can leave them here. Could Rosanne and Wolfgang come to the counter? You have a difficult task, because the question for you is how open science in research infrastructures can help bring down barriers to collaboration between researchers.
Sorry?
Again, how open science in research infrastructures can help bring down barriers to collaboration between researchers.
Okay. I don't know if he's just being polite or passing the buck here, or maybe passing the euro. I think that, first of all, open science creates access to information and communication. And I, in the past, have known researchers in some of the biggest labs in the world who didn't know what the researchers down the hall were working on. And this is really a problem. We need to communicate what is happening in the labs around the world so that researchers can work together. I think that technology and data banks and access to what is happening, information, is replacing the old conversations at the water cooler. It's the modern way of communication. And that communication will do a number of things. It will put researchers in touch with each other so they don't repeat unnecessarily experiments. They can work together to advance experiments faster. They can redefine their subjects to make them complementary and work together in that way. And if all of that fails, they can enter into a great competition and drive science ahead a little bit faster.
Thank you very much. Yes, indeed, we are living in the age of open science, and the European Commission is very strongly supporting this development, which completely changes the modus operandi of how we do science. So indeed, it offers huge possibilities to increase the excellence of research, the dissemination of research, the speed of dissemination of research results. So it has huge opportunities also to break down walls between researchers in the same discipline, but amongst disciplines, provided that we can use these possibilities. And evidently, I'm already approaching my 60 years, and I'm maybe not so fit for all these new developments when it comes to open science. But I've just tested recently the question of free access to research results by, I think it was Google Science. And I still found a lot of closed places for access to publications. So the first question is, not everything is open yet. Not everything is open yet. both in terms of research results and in terms of research data. But then, should it be open, the question arises, can we, both the academia, but also the business, use it? And that requires training, skills, and I think big efforts of each of us to do this kind of change in modus operandi, to break down exactly these walls. And I do not discuss here the technical requirements to break down these walls amongst disciplines and sectors. So I think my reply is yes, there are huge opportunities in open science in doing all these things, improve the excellence, improve the speed, improve the dissemination, but still I think we have huge challenges ahead to provide the necessary, to deliver the necessary framework for this.
I totally agree. There's the technology that needs to link all of these repositories and make it truly accessible. And secondly, there is the question of national regulations and foundations regulations and all the regulations, the questions of privacy that enter in. And then when we at the same time want to bring business in and industry, they are competing and they're not going to want everything to be accessible. So we have an open door and lots of obstacles to making it swing wide open.
Is Canada working on an open science cloud as well?
No.
No. So the Commission is unique. The EU is unique.
As always. No, I think I'm really proud of the fact that European Union, the European Commission, together with the member states, at a very early stage, has looked at the opportunities of open science. But again, as I have just indicated, the road is it's a long and winding road to get to the deliveries for the reasons we have just set out. Because I think for us, it's a real test in terms of governance. It's really a test in terms of governance. Because you have governments who want to have a say in this, and rightly so. You have public funders who have an interest in these questions. You have the research providing research infrastructures who have vested interests in these kind of things. And again, how do you govern this in a place, at least only for Europe, is 28 member states, X public funders, Y research infrastructures. And I think it was very difficult for us to now have in place a governance mechanisms that ensures the involvement of all the stakeholders in the development of at least the open science cloud, which is a federation of existing repositories.
And there are Asia and other areas of the world that don't even agree on the definition of open science. And so that adds a little bit of interest to the subject.
Would any of our African speakers like to come in on the question of open science cloud? Is it something that you're considering?
Well, I think there's some positive movement in that regard. I think driven by the SKA as a key platform for big data and analysis, there's a lot of work focused within the South African context and with the SKA partner countries around developing the data infrastructure that would be needed for the high-performance computing elements and data processing elements. I think ultimately it would be quite positive to seek to build a cloud that could serve the continent, perhaps. This SKA is based on the radio astronomy data, but data infrastructure could be used for any sorts of data, and I think it could grow from that to look at medical data, etc. But I think that's a conversation in progress that needs to happen.
Thank you. Are there any questions from the audience on this question of bringing barriers down on researcher collaboration? Yes, please. Can you please introduce yourself?
Christoph Häuser, Berlin Museum of Natural History, Leibniz Institute for Evolution and Biodiversity Science. Along the lines of breaking down barriers, I wonder whether at the times where national borders seems to go up, whether we as the people engaged in research infrastructures who have been a forerunner in breaking down barriers and generating international cooperation would agree to put up a call or even mechanisms to foster that. In science policy, I think this would translate in increasing our resources and our efforts to actually allowing or facilitating access to our facilities across borders, across continents, and perhaps also, if we can't bring our nationally founded or established facilities closer together internationally, at least do that or facilitate that for integrated data management. And if we agree on that, maybe we could put that or include that with an emphasis of a call for a record in this meeting. Thank you.
Would any of you like to comment? It's a comment more than a question, so it doesn't require any answer, I think. But unless Wolfgang.
Just to fully support the idea that research and collaboration in research really plays a key role in integrating Europe, but also in integrating our continent, exactly in times as we are living. And if I just look at Horizon 2020, and that's not necessarily research infrastructures, but overall, I think we have now 20,000 projects agreed, creating 500,000 links amongst physical people in Europe and all over the world. And that shows really the power of research cooperation in Europe and on a worldwide scale. So I fully support your remarks.
Very good. Thank you very much to both of you. Good job. Could I call Vinny and Paul, please, for the last for the last question that we will tackle in this way? And Paul, can you please come here? The question to the two of you relates to the long-term sustainability of research infrastructures. We heard about the money issue. Budgeting is an issue, and actually my first question is to you, Paul, because in Europe we are, Europe has a 7-year time frame to operate in. The US is only operating within a 1-year time frame. So how do you deal with that?
Yeah, so I think there's pros and cons of both systems. You know, from a US perspective, yearly budgets have their challenges. The positive part is that there has been a consistency, and actually in the near term, for those of you who haven't been following it, there's been a giant increase in science spending in the United States. If you look across the board of all the science areas, National Institutes of Health, National Science Foundation, NIST, the Office of Science that I run, we're up anywhere from 10 to 25% over the last 2 years. My area in particular is up 25%. So we actually have the problem of energy, of too much money. Well, no, the Office of Science is a confusion of what the Department of Energy is. It probably is better if you called it the Department of Energy and Science.
Very good.
Because the National Lab Complex does far more science work than energy work, but we do both, obviously, because of all the imaging, all the genomics, all the nuclear particle physics, and so on. So our run-up of infrastructure, we've accelerated. We have long-term business plans, so whether it's high-energy upgrade at SLAC, whether it's APSU upgrade at Argonne, all the science, large research infrastructure facilities, we are accelerating construction because of the 25% increase. So we have a significant increase in infrastructure build-out. which we're very happy about having that. And that looks, and it's not just us at National Institutes of Health and NSF and so on. So there's challenges, obviously, on the sustainability, because every year we have to go ask. And actually, one of the big challenges that we have is when we build a new facility, the operating costs go up. And so if our operating budget doesn't go up proportionally with the facilities coming on, we actually bring things on, we start them up, like a Jefferson lab on the nuclear physics side that we're doing for subatomic structure, and then the actual runtime was going to drop from the old facility compared to the old facility because the operating costs went up because of the power upgrade and others. And so we had to go back and ask for a proportional increase also in operating. But what's easier about the U.S., so that's a challenge. The easier about the U.S. is we have exactly one party to go ask, right? We don't have all the business structures that people are talking about in terms of all the partners. For our giant complex, it's just my office, and it's quite easy to have a conversation over a coffee with myself.
Okay, good. Money is one thing, but what else is required to ensure long-term sustainability of research infrastructures? SKA, for instance, actually, if we take the example of SKA.
Yeah. But I just want to touch on 2 points, which I think are critical, and we haven't really chatted about them. I think in my earlier intervention, I mentioned, the similar challenges of research infrastructures. They go to resource sustainability, with these both skills as well as the issue of finances, but also governance and the innovation ecosystem. But I think what's also important is trying to find the opportunities in those challenges. And I think for South Africa, and I just want to share this, from the policy perspective, it's been quite important. We developed our first white paper on science and technology in 1996. And basically, that was under the leadership of our then president, Nelson Mandela. And for some of you may know, this year we celebrate 100 years of Nelson Mandela. And that first white paper had references to national facilities. So in a way, kind of bringing in research infrastructures into that, and also looking at the issue of geographic advantage. So there were these kind of grand challenge areas that were identified in the white paper. And subsequently, in the last maybe 3 to 4 years, we've seen how at national government level, the issue of science has become a key cross-cutting area. So we've had something called the National Development Plan, which sets out a 2030 vision released by the presidency. And what this document does is it includes science and technology and innovation as a key component to achieving the goals and vision of that paper. Mm-hmm. And it seems quite apt this year as we celebrate 100 years of Nelson Mandela. We're busy developing an update of our white paper on science and technology. And in fact, a few days ago, the white paper was released for public comment. So my point is, yes, there are challenges, but you also need to use those challenges at a policy level, whether they're the research infrastructure component or general science and technology innovation, and turn them into opportunities. Because what it does, it helps invigorate a conversation across government. So research infrastructures are not just seen as, oh, this is some research facility out there and it's the mandate of the Ministry of Science and Technology, but how can those then be used across the other challenges that other ministries face, whether it's Department of Environmental Affairs or the Ministry of Health, etc. And I think that's become quite key. And just in terms of policy development as well, within the Meerkat, which is the South African precursor to the global project SKA, there's something called a National Geographic Advantage Act, which is basically a piece of legislation that protects the area in which the telescopes are being built. So it's kind of saying this area is protected specifically for the development of these telescopes, and there won't be any other development here. And
so it's more like a political act.
Yeah,
right?
and well, it's gone to cabinet, it's legislated, and it's adopted by cabinet and government. So I think there's other components to ensuring sustainability. And also I think if you have a good project and good ideas and good people, you make a plan.
Okay, good. Anyone would like to come in on the question of sustainability? Yes, here, please, a microphone. And please introduce yourself.
Thank you very much. I'm Director General of ICRI. My name is Werner Kutsch. And I may have a philosophical problem that many of the other research infrastructures share with me. Maybe the sustainability or the career of a research infrastructure is very similar to a career of a scientist. And there's one criteria, it's scientific excellence, and there's one currency, that's impact factor. And now we have heard about sustainable development goals, we have heard about inclusiveness, we have heard about transdisciplinarity, interdisciplinarity, and this is very often not compliant with scientific excellence or impact factor. If you include let's say a PhD student from Africa, even if you take him to the Max Planck Society, he may be a bit slower. He may not generate the same impact factor as a scientist as a well-trained German or American scientist. So,
do you agree with that? That's a strong statement, actually, and it also.
No, I tell you why. Because usually there are some steps to go and we have experiences with so-called universities for formerly, I don't know exactly the word, you have programs to support people in universities who were during the apartheid system not able to make a scientific career, and they have several decades where they missed a good education, and we cannot bridge this gap immediately. So there is a different starting point, and we have to see this.
Well, that's connected also to the inclusiveness question that we were mentioning.
And if you do the inclusiveness, if you do the interdisciplinarity, we are not fully reaching this one and only scientific excellence goals.
Okay, thank you.
I think this is important to reflect, and I really would like to have an answer how to manage this, that we come a bit away from this one scientific excellence criterion.
Thank you. Maybe you have an answer in the audience, and then then we'll go back on stage.
Is it working? Yeah. So I have
Please introduce yourself.
A quick question, I think mainly to Paul. My name is Samuel Doscher. I'm from DES in Hamburg. So I think it's a good opportunity to have this, decision makers from these various places here, and I think I heard from everybody how important this international collaboration is. So, but my question is now, what are now precise, concrete next steps, how to organize such a cooperation? We know each other, Paul, a little bit from the BISAC, and when you listened last time, the DOE labs have been, indicating that they have exactly the same technology problems as the X-ray facilities have in Europe, and they have been indicating that it would be very important to collaborate. Is it in your view possible to set up a program between DOE and Europe to support such common initiatives between the DOE labs and the European laboratories?
Okay, hold on. Don't answer now, because, hold on. We will keep the question for the final bit where we will have final recommendations on how to move forward. So this is an important question. Do you want to address first the question of different level of excellence, of scientific excellence that the gentleman was raising?
That is your opinion, sir, with all respect to you. I don't think we can generalize. But what I do want to say is that ultimately it doesn't matter whether you have a research infrastructure in Africa, anywhere in Africa, or in Europe or the US, you need the finances. And ultimately those finances come out of your fiscal. And if you don't make the argument to your politicians about what benefit that research infrastructure brings back into your society, whether it's the great science, whether it's creating jobs, etc., then the chances and the difficulty that you have in accessing those funds is a challenge. So for me, it's not just, yes, it is about excellence, but at the same time, where do you get those funds if you don't convince your politicians to make the commitment to that funding?
Thank you, Vinny. All right.
So the way I approach this is it's not just about particular background and particular studies and particular points that have been raised by an individual. It's also about creativity. And how I think about this is that if you look at some of the greatest innovators in the science area, if you look at Einstein did not perform horribly well in school. He was a third-tier patent clerk in Switzerland, and he took a long time in order for Berlin to identify that he actually had something. And he came up with his ideas at night when he was a patent clerk in Switzerland. And so the way I think about diversity at the end of the day is it's bringing people who have other ideas about certain topics to the table and allowing them to contribute, I think is very important. And it's a two-way street. I know we learn from people who are different than ourselves, who have a different experience and approach it differently, and they learn from us. And I think it's very important to be inclusive of people who come from different countries, different backgrounds, different educational experiences, because I do think that creativity is not as highlighted as it should many times. And I have this conversation with people from Silicon Valley a lot, where the idea around the application of a theory is equally as important as actually coming up with it.
Very good. We'll stop this topic here. Thank you to the both of you. And we are now in the final bit of this session, and we'll make it short and snappy. So what I want from each of you, the context is the negotiations around Horizon Europe are underway. So Wolfgang, you cannot answer this one, but I'm sure that the Commission and the Austrian presidency will take notes on what the others would like to recommend. You'll have also your words, don't worry. But that first question is about what would you recommend? What would you advise the Europeans to do in shaping Horizon Europe to improve research infrastructures and improve international cooperation? Very concretely, is there one advice or one thing you'd like to see in Horizon Europe for a better international cooperation? Who would like to start? Shumete, please.
Yeah, probably more advice is needed for the global south, for Ethiopia, rather than the EU. Just from my point of view. Well, I have seen there are so many advancements in research infrastructure, but still the question of governance, because we have said so many things about open science and open science platform, and open was at the forefront of this conference. And so that is very important to look into the governance of open science and also the research infrastructure. So my colleagues have been talking about the sustainability, and sustainability issues needs ownership. Who owns? Because we are planning to share resources from many corners of the world, in EU and from the south, and so on and so on, so that merit-based access and accountability and responsibility and all these things are very important in order to make it sustainable. That's very important. The other one is research infrastructure needs huge investment for human capital investment and also for the physical infrastructure. And so interconnectedness and partnerships in the north and the south is very important. Particularly the governance issue, I would like it to be underlined again and again.
Okay.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Who else? Maybe from the US perspective.
I'll address that and also the question that was just posed. I think at the end of the day, the roadmaps the various communities have created around infrastructure, in particular in Europe and the United States, are pretty well known. I have a list of the major research infrastructure facilities that various countries in the EU have looked at proposing. I brought it with me, I reviewed it, I studied everything that was proposed, and I have the list of the very large research infrastructure facilities that we're looking to propose. And I think the right next step is to actually figure out the right venue for us to get together and say, where is there complementary overlap, where there are certain facilities that are proposed in the EU that should get done in the EU for various different reasons, and how can other countries, and I'll say from the United States point of view, how can we contribute using the track record of CERN, of the Large Hadron Collider, of LB&F Dune and others, and then vice versa. What are things that would make sense for certain European countries to do? So I have a list. I would love to figure out the right venue. The biggest challenge as an American is who to talk to here, right? It's kind of a little hard to exactly identify whether it's an EU topic, it's an individual country context. It's always a bit hard for us to navigate that. It's a little bit easier, at least, to navigate on our side. There's a very small number of people who kind of drive the points. So I would ask, and I would love to find out the right venues for us to go through those lists and for us to figure out exactly where to be investing together.
Very important point. What about Canada, South Africa?
I think going forward under Horizon Europe, I mean, the big thing is to continue with international collaboration. And I think research infrastructures provide quite a key enabling mechanism, if one wants to talk about that, to continue. And I think in terms of all the discussions we've had over the last few days, whether it's been around, we've seen the big thing is data. So I think we should be talking a little bit about how we can collaborate in making assessments, investigations into the data, creating data infrastructure that can help collaboration.
Very good. Roseanne.
I think at the conference we've heard that there are two ways to go about this. One is bottom up and the other is top down. And the bottom up is the researchers themselves generating the ideas and working together. And that's what we see happening in the physics community, in the astronomy community. They are building the dialogue and the conversation and the needs that they will have so that we can all together support them. And I think that is the strongest way to proceed because we build on a base of excellence, already dialogue, and desire and need previously identified. The other way is top-down, and that can carry on as well, because we know that there are certain big facilities that we maybe don't want to carry on or that need renovation and that need upgrade. And whether one country upgrades and another lets theirs down, that could be done as well through negotiation and shared resources. So I think that we need to go both bottom up and top down, and that way we will find a good use of our funds, but also the best results in science.
Michael, is there anything that you'd like to see addressed with Horizon Europe in terms of cooperation between Russia and the EU in the field of research infrastructures?
Okay. Maybe good idea, and Russia now on the way to realize it, to produce very open access to these large facilities and organize very good digital connection from the working place of each science in Russia and Europe and Africa and in other places with this facility. So it requires, of course, the large openness of the scientific program. It's not a problem right now. So you see, and as I said, we are now on the way to do this. There are some projects like Kremlin project and so on.
Okay, good. Barbara, can I come to you? Austria has a long tradition of, I'll put one more here. Austria has a long tradition of building bridges, and I think this conference is another very good example of that. So, is there anything that you think should be done, under Horizon Europe, but more generally, to build more bridges in the field of research infrastructures?
Well, as our colleague from the US said, it's much more difficult who to talk to in the European Union because it's always two layers. Of course, all of us have an interest in bilateral international cooperation, and our science funds and academies of sciences have agreements, and there's a lot of cooperation on the basis of joint research projects and individual research groups and institutions. But then, of course, also within the European Union, for international cooperation, it's actually the European Commission on behalf of the member states in a lot of fields negotiating technological agreements. On the other hand, in research infrastructure, there is the ICRI chair, and there is this community of large-scale European research infrastructures. So I'm sure that in the end of the day, it's only a handful of people who would need to come together with the lead of the European Commission. And the ICRI conferences are certainly ideal platforms of enabling, and the next one being Canada. The US is not so far away, so maybe that's the best place then to actually really come into the doing.
All right, thank you. Wolfgang, the final word is yours. I saw you were taking notes, so what are your takeaways?
What I've written down is that Paul is referring to Henry Kissinger. Who should I call if I would like to get somebody on the phone in Europe? And indeed, as Barbara has pointed out, it is a fact of life that the responsibilities when it comes to research and innovation are shared between the European Union and the member states. And evidently that implies certain complexities also in terms of international cooperation. But as Barbara has also put it very clearly, if there is envy in this place to cooperate with Europe, it will not fail because of competence and complexity issues. So that should not be, I think, a pretext not to cooperate. And I'm sure, as Paul has pointed out, we will find the right addressees. When it comes more generally to Horizon Europe, just 2-3 remarks. What is in for cooperation in research infrastructures? Firstly, I think you all know that our Horizon Europe will be open to the world. This means that everybody on individual terms can participate in calls under Horizon 2020, and many of those who are successful will even get reimbursement even if they are not associated to Horizon Europe. That's the first thing. Secondly, I think we have pointed out very clearly that we are open for even further association to Horizon Europe, which evidently has also implications on research infrastructures. And thirdly, I think, and that I come to more the research infrastructure issue, you know that one of the key elements of the research and innovation, the research infrastructure funding in Horizon 2020, but also in Horizon Europe, is access to research infrastructures. And if third countries' researchers would like to have access to research infrastructures, they can get paid for this access to European research infrastructures. But then I would also like to underline what both the colleague from Ethiopia and from Rosanne, what they have said. Governance a lot is done presently bottom-up. I think many of these things arise, and if there are good bottom-up initiatives in terms of cooperation between research infrastructures, there will be possibilities to fund them. We have already on international level, I think it was mentioned yesterday by Commissioner Moedas, we have SESAM, we have PRIMA, we have Arctic cooperation, we have initiatives with Russia on specific cooperation in research infrastructures. So even at the European level, there are possibilities to have more focused cooperation in research infrastructures, both with also in the context with African Union, we have quite a lot of possibilities.
All right, I think it's perfect. Thank you very much. Please join me and applaud these 7 speakers that have done a great job. You can go back to your seats. Thank you very much. No? Hold on, Daniel.
Thank you for your tough questions.
Thank you. Thank you. And now I'd like to call on stage. Daniel still needs something. No, that's all right. So now I'd like to call on stage our next speaker, who is Heidi Alberta Aula, an ambassador from Canada to Austria and Slovakia. Heidi, please. You want to go here?
Very much. Thank you very much. Such a pleasure to be with you all here at the closing of the International Conference on Research Infrastructures 2018. I've had a look at your agenda, and I just want to begin by thanking and congratulating our Austrian hosts for putting together not only such a compelling program, but attracting such an impressive and broad international participation, and above all, perhaps, for providing such a magnificent setting for your meetings. It's an example that I hope my own country can follow, because it gives me great pleasure today to confirm that Canada will host this prestigious and unique international conference in 2020. Canada, like Austria, relies... Thank you. Thank you. Thank you very much. Canada is very much like Austria in that we rely on our global collaboration and the global research community to be at the forefront of research and the benefits of science and technology development. Canada, for this reason, values these relationships tremendously. And if I may say, Europe is a particularly important audience for this kind of partnership. Nearly 40% of all co-authored international research publications in my country are co-authored and co-published with European partners. Canadian experts are able to co-publish with their European colleagues in part because of the EU's open to the world approach to research and innovation programming, which is so important for fostering international collaboration. We particularly look forward to working with our EU partners as it develops Horizons Europe, which will enable greater opportunities for collaboration between European funders, researchers, and innovators and their partners in Canada and around the world. Research infrastructures, I don't need to tell the people in this room, are increasingly recognized as enablers of both the advancement of knowledge and international collaboration. As a result, we are starting to see the emergence of truly global research networks. As a scientifically advanced country that is open to the world, Canada is committed to doing its part to contribute to this very welcome development. We've already seen great success in the scientific partnership between Austria and Canada. For example, particularly in relation to research collaboration and best practices exchanges in the field of green building technology. For example, the Canada Green Building Council is actively involved as an associate research partner in the Austrian Zero Energy and Emission Building Network. Similarly, the cities of Vienna and Vancouver have recently signed an MOU and are currently identifying a plot of land in each city to conduct joint research on low-emission homes. The University of Innsbruck and the University of Northern British Columbia are exchanging scientists in the field of systematic connection systems to develop common research programs. Partnerships like these highlight the essential role of research infrastructures in addressing global challenges and contributing to our sustainable development goals. In hosting ICRI 2020, Canada hopes to further mature such innovative and important research collaboration. Distinguished participants, as we work to improve the lives and well-being of people in our countries through research, infrastructure, and discovery, Canada believes that we will all benefit from sharing different perspectives and ideas from around the world. It's therefore our intent to strive to broaden the diversity of voices involved in these discussions at ICRI 2020. Hosting ICRI illustrates the importance that both Canada and Austria place on international collaboration and building partnerships in the domain of science and technology. I'm confident that we'll be able to build on the outcomes of ICRI 2018 and continue this crucial bridge-building exercise by fostering even closer exchange between Canada, Austria, and Europe over the years to come. And if I may, I'd now like to invite Dr. Roseanne O'Reilly-Runte, President and CEO of the Canada Foundation for Innovation, to give us more details about ICRI 2020. Roseanne, please come to the stage. Thank you very much.
Excellency, thank you so much. And I know we all join in thanking once again our Austrian and European community colleagues for this wonderful conference. The venue, the venue has been superb, the organization practically flawless, and the participation really excellent. So thank you all in the audience as well. And we're counting on you to come back in 2020. So we're delighted to welcome you to Canada in 2020. I hope you get out your little agendas right now and put a red circle somewhere around September 30th and plan that you will come to Canada at that time. Plan that you will come, hopefully, to Ottawa. And Ottawa means the coming together of waters, the meeting of waters. And I can't think of a better place than to have Ottawa be the place where we bring together the great minds, again at this conference, and others from around the world to converge in solving some of the problems that come from bringing together nations and peoples, disciplines and sectors to work together as we try to make open science happen, as we try to better define the results of what we do and communicate them, as we try to work together to solve some of the problems of the world. So I look forward to hearing your ideas about what you would like to hear and see and speak about at the next conference. And I look forward to being able to say to you, when you get to the land of the maple leaf, welcome, bienvenue, and herzliche willkommen. Thank you.
Thank you. I don't think it's working, is it? Yeah, thank you very much. So very exciting to hear that the next ICRI will be in Canada. So the final word is to our wonderful host, Barbara.
Well, thank you so much for the announcement, and we all look forward in a little bit more than 2 years' time to be in Ottawa. Actually, it's only been 3 days ago that I had the honor, almost at the same time, because we started at 1 o'clock, to be here to open the conference. It feels like a much longer time because you had very intensive discussions, workshops, and also, I think, a framework program that I'm amazed that so many of you are still wide awake and present here at the end of the conference, actually. What I have experienced, and I was not able to be with you all the time because we actually had several EU presidency events during the same days, but all the reactions, all the feedback I got was very positive, and I could experience during the hours I was with you a very positive, very inspiring atmosphere and a lot of hard working as well, even during the coffee breaks. So I really think that this conference is an ideal international platform for exchange and for moving forward the important aspect of research infrastructure. What I would also like to stress at the end of the program and thank the program committee for the excellent job that it was not just an interesting program, but you really managed to have a geographical balance with all the continents covered and 59 nationalities represented in the conference. So I think this is something for the next program committee and the next host to continue and maybe to have even a larger international participation. And also the gender balance worked well, so maybe we should really give a big hand to the program committee. Finally, I would like to thank the team of the European Commission, who is also the sponsor of this event, and the organizing team of my ministry. Most of them are not in this hall now because they organize and they make sure that everything goes well for the final part, the luncheon at the conference. But I would really like to thank all of you for having organized this conference tirelessly and excellently. And thank all the participants for having come here, having stayed, and hopefully all of you take home some lessons learned, some new ideas, and definitely a lot of interest in joint cooperation, not just within the European research area, but internationally. So let me conclude with our message that we started the conference with. Let's advance the world together. Thank you. And I hereby officially close the conference and invite you outside. Thank you.